Age of Empires 4 will have a humanly unbeatable AI, but could that really be possible? Or are the devs being unrealistic? Welcome to Age of Noob, everyone. Now let's talk about that. AI, or artificial intelligence, has been historically a tricky thing to implement in video games. As gamers, we're so used to bad or mediocre AI in games, in not just RTS but in video games in general, that we've almost accepted the fact that friendly AIs are useless, enemy AIs cheat, and for the sake of not ruining our immersion, we ignore all the jarring mishaps the AI commits in our games, especially in story-based ones. I can't think of an example where the AI acted and played so human-like that it was impossible to tell that it was AI.
Keep your hands to yourself. I'm going to find whoever did this.
The truth of the matter is that nothing has passed the Turing test yet. Now, before we continue any further, this video will tackle Age of Empires 4's implementation of AI, but we're going to brush up on the process of developing such an impossible-to-beat machine learning-based one, as well as how the AI in Age of Empires today is coded. So use the timestamps I've added below to navigate to certain sections if learning about how to build a machine learning-based AI doesn't really interest you. Otherwise, stick around for some fascinating computer science. Alright, the reason why we have rarely, if ever, been convinced of AI in video games is because there's technically no real intelligence behind it. Most AIs in games are essentially just algorithms, or giant if statements to simplify it even further. Just as a quick disclaimer, I will be vastly oversimplifying things for the sake of brevity, but here's a quick snippet of Spirit of the Law's video back in 2019 about how AI is currently coded in Age of Empires 2.
Here it is. It's tens of thousands of lines of code outlining all of its strategies and behaviors. You'll find things ranging from pre-programmed strategies depending on its civilization, to rules about minimum water sizes for docks, what to do in deathmatch games, and how often and where to build new mills if the number of farms increases. Everything it does comes down to the simple idea of an if-then statement. In this example of a rule, if a particular condition is met, and in this case the AI has more than 15 farms and a single town center with less than 2 mills, then it will build another.
As you can see, most AIs in games are an attempt of a human being coding a playbook for the computer to simulate and act based on the instructions and inputs given, just like when and where to build its second mill as we just watched. In examples other than Age of Empires, the human coder tells the AI that if you took damage, take cover and heal. Randomly act aggressively against the human player, but if the player points again at you,
I want to apologize.
You get the point. Now, of course, algorithms get much more complex. In Age of Empires, the AI can be instructed to train pikemen in Castle Age when it sees the player is going for knights. But that is sometimes not the optimal solution. Sometimes you have to go for camels. Sometimes you have to match the player's knights with your own knights. Sometimes it could be defensive monks, and the list goes on. Games today are rarely as simple if X happens, then do Y. So the person coding the quote-unquote artificial intelligence has to develop an algorithm complex enough to be able to handle all of these situations effectively, and this is a painful process. In some games, this is good enough. Shooters, for example, are easier to code because changing the damage of their bullets or improving their aim is a very straightforward thing to implement. They don't need to be too intelligent to give the player a hard time. Aim, reaction time, and other non-decision-based gameplay elements are undoubtedly favored for the computer against the human, so coding the movements that is close to that of a human being is good enough for those games. Even then, developers still often struggle with this, as idiotic NPCs continue to ruin gameplay with bad movement. In Age of Empires, we have to think a lot more than just movement. Since AoE is primarily a game of decision-making, coding AI like this becomes very, very difficult. And since an AI's level or ELO is determined by what decisions it makes, the old way of manually, algorithmically coding AI unfortunately falls quite short. Currently, the best AI developed so far for Age of Empires 2DE is Extreme AI, and it has definitely improved since its launch. Most experienced players would estimate that Extreme AI's elo should fall somewhere around 1200 RM 1v1. This means that the AI is definitely better than the average player on the ladder, but it's certainly nothing special. Furthermore, this elo is often true only when you let the AI survive to around the mid-game, as it is so easy to exploit many of its shortcomings in the beginning of the game, even if you're not a better player yourself. So, what's holding Extreme AI back? Well, there are actually a few reasons. Number 1. The developer who codes the AI is not and will never be the best player in the world. It's just the rule of life. This means that the coder has to instruct the AI how to behave based on his or her level or attempt to copy what the professional players are doing. For example, the coder for Extreme AI has implemented many build orders that have been perfected over the last 20 years by the pro scene. This means that the developer who coded this AI already had an advantage that most other developers don't. In other words, the developer who will be coding AoE 4's AI is royally screwed because that developer will have no idea what the optimal builds are. He or she most definitely can take their best guess, but its build orders will be soon obsolete after the pros establish the meta. In other words, if we continue with this example, when you must tell the AI what build orders is optimal, you've already shot yourself in the foot. The coder will simply have to copy whatever the established meta is and will always lag behind the pros because there is no real intelligence behind it, just a set of instructions. In short, the first problem is that the AI is bound by the level of game knowledge of the person coding it and will always play catch-up with the players who are defining the meta with each patch. Number 2, there are human limitations to this method. The coder might not be great at writing the best algorithms. The coder does not have the time or brain power to think of all of the possible reactions the AI needs to give. The coder is limited in terms of the system resources he or she can hog from the player's PC. Maybe there are some in-game engine limitations, and the list goes on. When the AI cannot truly think for itself, it is at the mercy of the playbook. This is why early rushing the AI often results in a guaranteed win because it is inept at dealing with wacky strategies. Even if the coder patches against some of these strategies, players will always find other exploits to throw it off and bug it out. It's always an uphill battle the coder cannot win because it's impossible to think of all of the things the player could possibly do in the game that plays out in real time. Number 3, the AI never improves. The 1200 elo player today in the RM ladder in Age of Empires 2DE is a significantly better player than the 1200 elo player back when the game was first launched. This power creep, or player-based skill improvement, is an inevitable phenomenon, and is especially seen in well-established ranked ladders such as League of Legends and Dota. Being the average player in 2014 was much easier than being the average player today in 2021. You need to know more about the game and play better as time goes on, as your human opponents will get tougher to beat at the same elo. The AI, on the other hand, is at the mercy of the coder's patches. If left abandoned, the AI will soon become too weak. The meta will change, build orders will evolve, but the AI will still be doing the same thing that it did. Of course, the coder can always work on and improve the AI, but this goes back to points 1 and 2. He or she will simply have to play catch-up and will still be within the limitations identified in the previous 2 points. Number 4, and perhaps most importantly, it is extremely difficult, if not flat out impossible, to code human intuition and improvisation manually. Within the context of video games, most of us summarize this by using the term game sense. Game sense is what separates the likes of the top 0.1% of players who are godlike players in their own right from the likes of the best like the Viper or Hera. Pro players' ability to think on their feet, outside the box, or understanding the net value of the decisions they make is unparalleled. But we don't have to go to those extremes to make our point against the AI. Let me give you some basic scenarios any average player can come up with. The AI is instructed that it should flee with its villagers when there are some archers around. But should it return to the same lumber camp? What if the archers come right back in? Should it spend an extra 100 wood to build another lumber camp in another wood line? But what if the archers circle towards that wood line? Then what? This is where the code fails. You need intuition to think ahead of how you'll deal with those archers while keeping your lumberjacks safe. The same issue happened with tower rushes, which was the bane of Extreme AI's existence. The coder eventually patched it by instructing villagers to rush and batter down the forward tower to defend against tower rushes. But what if there's an enemy archer or two next to the tower? You're instructed to run away from the archers. Should you check for fletching and take the loss of 1 or 2 villagers? Was it worth bringing down that tower and losing a villager for it? What if the player quick walls around the tower? The possibilities of the code failing is simply too many. So those were intuition examples, but what about improvisation? The average player in Black Forest or Arena often can think of using onagers to sneak a cut into the base of their opponent. If this tactic is not inherently coded in the AI, can it think on its own and come up with a strategy? Can it think of understanding the game engine and body blocking enemy units to secure a kill? Can it think of using building foundations to quick wall out enemy soldiers? Can it figure out that you can influence the deer's movements and therefore lure them back into the TC and save villager walk time? The answer is no. You simply cannot code this without explicitly instructing the AI how to do the aforementioned things. So, we've established that the current way of coding AI sucks, especially for real-time decision-based games. There are so many limitations to it, and that makes it impossible for the AI to compete with great players. So why are Adam and Quinn so confident that they claim that Age of Empires 4 will have an impossible-to-beat AI, including professional players? 2 words: machine learning. Machine learning, just like AI, big data, neural networks, and so on, is a term that is often quite misused in so many contexts, especially by corporations using them as buzzwords to market a product. The reality is that most of the time these corporations are straight up lying or using a very tiny fraction of its use and labeling the whole thing as one of them. Okay, so what exactly is machine learning then? Machine learning, which is under the umbrella of artificial intelligence, is also about computer algorithms similar to the ones that we've just discussed, but the key difference is that it can improve on its own through experience and use of data. Machine learning algorithms build a model based on sample data, known as training data, in order to make predictions or decisions without it being explicitly programmed to do so. Now, there's neural networks, decision trees, deep learning, and more specific branches, but again, I'm going to keep it broad for the sake of brevity for our topic. So, in short and in plain English, machine learning is the medium to have an ever-evolving piece of software that improves the more it is used and trained. Within the context of gaming, the training dataset would be the data collected from playing games. The more games it plays, the more data it collects, and the better it trains itself. However, most people stop here and don't really mention the limitations of machine learning today, its cost, and whether it can be even implemented in certain scenarios. To showcase this, here's a short snippet from a very simple hide-and-seek game developed by OpenAI, one of the leading institutions in AI research. The goal is simple. There are hiders and seekers. Both teams are controlled by AI, and the AI is supposed to learn and get better at hiding and seeking with time. The game ends when the seekers get a direct line of sight on the hiders. The hiders and the seekers can interact with the yellow objects as you can see on the map, but that's pretty much it. You can see the rest of the rules about the game on the screen. Remember folks, the person who set this up did not give any instructions on how to behave or play the game. The hiders and seekers only know the rules of the game and how to interact with the map and its objects. That's it. The game is then simulated a few million times, and what we observe is that both the hiders and the seekers run around aimlessly and with no strategy. You heard it right, a few million rounds were played before we can observe any meaningful progress. Since their movements are all erratic, the seekers almost always win because they eventually fall into the line of sight of their opponents. After those few million rounds, the hiders finally figure out that they can keep out the seekers by blocking them out using the boxes. This time, the seekers were unable to figure out how to get in if they're blocked out by the boxes. It took them 10 million rounds to figure out that they can use the ramp-like object they had at their disposal to climb up and win the game. So the Seekers were finally able to be winning again using the ramp. Finally, after another 8 million rounds, the Hiders understood that the Seekers were actually frozen and blind for a few seconds before the game even began. Hence, they figure out that they can actually take the ramp inside with them before boxing out the Seekers. In this particular map, there is no other way for the Seekers to get in, so this was the endgame. But it took both teams tens of millions of rounds to figure out what humans would otherwise be able to in just a few rounds played. Here's a few interesting bits though. In another map, one of the Seekers, who could not get to a Hider who boxed himself in with walls, figured out that it can actually use a ramp to jump on top of a box and essentially box surf above and over the walls of the Hider. This was completely unintentional, as the makers of this game did not know this was even possible. In another instance, one of the Hiders was able to identify a bug in which it could actually chuck away the ramp to outside of the map from the previous game setup. It doesn't stop here. One of the Seekers was able to abuse another bug in the game to launch itself on top of the Hiders. It's pretty funny, but amazing at the same time. So the reason why we went through all of this is to showcase a few things. First, it is often misunderstood that machine learning AI is this magical thing that it will be able to copy your build order or tactics right after you defeat it, just like how a human opponent would think and attempt to do. With today's technology, this is simply not the case. Adam and Quinn have mentioned that the AI will learn by playing against humans, but unless they can get tens of hundreds of millions of games out of humans, the data gathered would simply be too small to get any meaningful improvement out of it. Remember folks, the game I showcased before is a super simple hide-and-seek game with extremely limited interactions and rules. Age of Empires is the polar opposite, with a ton of variety and complexity that the AI will need to figure out. Hence, unless they can get a player base in the millions and convince them to play against the AI every day on hours on end, I just simply don't see this realistically being implemented anytime soon. We also have to remember that the vast majority of the players are nowhere near as good as the likes of Viper or Hera, so the AI won't be doing too much learning anyway, since the average player cannot even beat Extreme AI in DE today. That said, they can simply train the AI by making it play against itself, which is most likely what they've already partially did anyway, and use high elo player data as a supplemental training set, so it's more than doable. Second, machine learning AI can be used to test the game for bugs or exploits that humans would otherwise completely miss. No human can test or play the game literally billions of times, but the AI can, just like how we saw that the Hiders were able to chuck away the ramp outside of the map using a very specific angle. And finally, while it is true that human intuition allows us to learn things so much faster than any machine learning model, we are unfortunately bound by two things. We only have one brain to learn with, and we only have 24 hours in a day and roughly 100 years to live. Machine learning has no such limits. You can run as many instances as you want, running simultaneously 24/7. This means that when you commit 40 minutes to learning from one game, it can learn from millions of games in that same 40 minutes. So, as the technology and processing power gets better in the future, it's only a matter of time until artificial intelligence truly surpasses us in intuition as well. So, you survived through all of that to get to this main point, the Merciless AI in Age of Empires 4. Let's summarize all of what we've gone through and apply it to the context of this game. Presumably, the developers would implement an artificial neural network and set very broad instructions to give it a sense of direction. In Dota, for example, OpenAI was able to achieve this feat by instructing the neural network very basic concepts, such as generating gold in Dota is good, dying is bad, taking damage is also bad, and so on. Then, we just let it play against itself. The developers can run the game much faster than real time and, as mentioned earlier, can run multiple instances as well. Now, I'm not a professor or a PhD researcher in AI like those guys, but here's my estimate on how the neural network would be set up for Age of Empires 4. First, let's get through a list of things to completely avoid. Number 1, we need to avoid any specific instructions, such as any build orders whatsoever. We simply cannot tell the neural network what to do and build with its villagers. Number 2, we also cannot say what engagements it should and should not take. We know that knights are countered by pikemen, for example, but we're not going to tell the AI to flee with its knights when it's up against pikemen. The AI already knows the bonus damages of units as it knows every value within the game's engine. Hence, we will not give any indication on when or how to take any engagements with any specific unit type. Number 3, we will also not mention any strategies or common acts such as walling up, raiding the enemy's economy, and so on. Once again, we cannot let us do the thinking for the AI. It needs to identify those and come up with those strategies on its own. Alright, now that we have those out of the way, what could we tell the neural network to train itself then? Well, it'll be very similar to how it was implemented in Dota. However, this part is still very tricky. First, we can start by saying that creating villagers is good. We can also say creating military units is good. Hence, higher population overall is good. Second, gathering resources is good. Third, your units dying or being converted is bad. 4, your buildings being destroyed is bad. Notice how we're not mentioning anything about which units it should fight with, when to repair buildings that are under attack, or anything of that sort. We're simply stating that, generally, your knights dying and your buildings being destroyed is a bad thing, but how it handles these is up for it to decide. 5, conversely, killing enemy units is good, and 6, destroying enemy units is also good. Now, we can simply end it here and allow it to train itself now. Depending on the results, the developers might opt to give more direction if the AI is really not getting anywhere after millions of games. For example, we might opt to add things like defending resources is good or denying enemy resources is good, and so on. Keep in mind that the neural network will be able to eventually work out the trade-offs. For example, just because we said that your units dying is a bad thing, doesn't mean that it will not be able to eventually figure out that certain engagements are worth dying for to get an advantage later, or to deny your opponent of something. This is why we keep those conditions vague and general, and it figures out the rest. Eventually, it will come up with the most optimal build orders, with the wackiest working cheese strategies, with the correct army compositions and taking the right engagements. We, as humans, will not be able to catch up. Even the Viper or Hera do not always know whether they will win a very close engagement, but the AI will get to such a level that it will always take the advantageous engagements and flee from disadvantageous ones. Once humans figure this out and play accordingly, it will most likely learn to bait humans next, i.e., once the AI figures out that the humans now know that the AI will never take a losing engagement, it might opt to take bad engagements on purpose to confuse and bait the humans. By the way, this is not a far-fetched guess or idea. This is reality. It already happened in Dota. The AI learned the art of debating, where it seemingly took a lot of damage for apparently no reason at first, only to bait the pro player into taking an engagement where something in the fog of war was waiting to turn the tide. It'll get to a point where we won't know why it's doing what it's doing, but we'll know that it's always planned and will eventually always lose. While it may be scary, it is most definitely also fascinating. So there you have it, folks. I know this has been a long video, but I wanted to give you folks a solid grasp on how AI works in Age of Empires today and how these new amazing techniques are used for upcoming AIs. If you're as fascinated as me regarding this field of research, I've linked below some of the videos I've mentioned throughout the video for you folks to explore even further. And if you've enjoyed this type of content from Age of Noob, please consider supporting me and the channel by hitting that subscribe button as well as the like button. These videos take a very long time to make, so I hope you folks have been enjoying this new format. To wrap up, will Age of Empires 4 have an unbeatable AI at launch? No. Will it eventually get there? Well, if Microsoft brings its A game, then yeah, quite possibly. Let me know in the comments below on what you folks think about this topic as well. Even if the initial results of Merciless AI is underwhelming, it's still exciting to see that they've started implementing machine learning, and hopefully it will one day reach a level in which even pro players will not be able to beat it. But until then, we'll continue to observe the pros do their magic.